Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump says it was a very good meeting on interest rates. Welcome to the Friday edition as the president leaves a storm of news behind in Washington today, flying to Scotland for a weekend of golf and trade talks, it turns out. But the pressure on Powell continues. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall, live in Washington. And Tyler, we're going to explore ahead what's motivating the president here to continue this campaign in a special conversation with Lael Brainard.
Right, exactly. And we heard President Trump yesterday saying that there's, quote, no tension with Jerome Powell. He's going to let him serve out his term, but also gave him a little tap, a little punch on the arm there when he mentioned wanting to lower interest rates next week when the FOMC meets. It
manifested itself physically at one point as the two showed up with hard hats. But of course, he talked about it again in the driveway at the White House, Tyler. He kept saying again that he thinks Powell will do the right thing. He said they had a great talk on interest rates. Powell told him that the economy was strong. It sounds like he's holding out hopes for the Fed meeting next week, and I'm not sure anybody else is. It certainly does. It's something that, of course, we're going to be watching closely, as well as the markets are watching, which is where we start now with Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet reporting from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, and good day from steamy New York. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P 500 index up 24 points right now. We are trading at a record 63.88, gain there of just about 0.4%. Stocks rising with the temperature. We've got the Dow up 117, up by about 0.3%. A NASDAQ up 79 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, an advance right now of just about 0.4%. Our Mag 7 index climbing by 0.9%. Tesla part of that index, of course. It is up by 5%. I mentioned Tesla because yesterday it sold off by 8.2%. Your 10-year 4.38%. Your 2-year 3.91%. Spot gold at $33.30 the ounce, down 1.1%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is now lower by 1%. WTI 65.39 a barrel on WTI. S&P 500 index, by the way, advancing every single day this week, right now on track for a gain of just about 1.3% on the week. As stocks move higher, a notable exception, Intel. After earnings, Intel is plunging by 9.3%. CEO Lip-Bu Tan is sparking concerns that he's more focused on cost-cutting than restoring the chipmaker's technological edge. Again, Intel down now by 9.2%. Recapping, S&P 500 index is advancing up by about 0.4%. And in Boston, specifically at Fenway, concession workers on strike. Their contract with vendor Aramark expired at the end of last year. The strike took effect today. First pitch for the Red Sox Dodgers game 7:10 tonight in Boston. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts Joe Mathieu and Tyler Kendall.
All right, Charlie Pellet from World Headquarters in New York, thank you so much. I know Joe, as a former Bostonian, is paying close attention to that last story there. But we here right now are tracking a few different threads as we head into the weekend. President Trump heading over to Scotland, a headline breaking on the Bloomberg terminal last hour that he's going to meet with the EU's Ursula von der Leyen to continue trade talks. But another big focus, and definitely the focus of yesterday, was President Trump's recent comments about the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. And he was asked about his visit to the Fed's renovation site yesterday as he headed out on his trip. We want to bring you part of what he said earlier.
We had a very good meeting. Forgetting about the building, that's out of control and all that. But I think we had a very good meeting on interest rates. And he said to me, now I don't know if he's going to say this on Thursday or whenever he speaks, but he said to me very strongly, the country is doing well. He said, congratulations. The country is doing really well. And I got that to mean that I think he's going to start recommending lower rates.
Hot out there today in the nation's capital. It's 90-something degrees right now. It's supposed to feel like 107 later, so maybe his timing was right, as opposed to those going to Fenway Park this weekend. That ought to be something, although I guess they're making some concessions to make that work. Tyler Kendall. The president said one thing yesterday. By the way, we're going to be talking about this with Lael Brainard in a moment, and I can't wait to hear her thoughts on this, having written an op-ed in the Washington Post about this very matter. Wendy Benjaminson, the president, yesterday said, I think he's going to start recommending lower rates because of that conversation. That is a continuation of the pressure campaign.
It absolutely is a continuation of the pressure, just when we thought after that meeting that the pressure had eased up a bit, right? Because he toured the construction site, which is something former developer Donald Trump loves to do. He put on a hard hat, he walked through the construction site, and he seemed to deem it under control. Yeah. Slapped Powell on the back, made a joke about interest rates. Powell stunningly fact-checked him publicly in real time, seemed to have gotten away with it. And markets reacted positively to that whole scene, thinking, well, now Powell has his job. Now, this morning's comments could mean that Trump still feels very confident that now Powell sees things the way he does. But come Thursday, if those interest rates don't come down, I think he'll be back to being what Donald Trump calls a numbskull and too late and a disappointment and all that. And this nice little bromance that brewed up yesterday will be over again.
Well, let's look at this broader picture, because we have a great story on the Bloomberg terminal this morning that I know that you edited, Wendy, about this idea of how Trump's strategy when it comes to pressuring the Fed is about flooding the zone. Exactly. Can you talk to us what led to us to this point? Because this originally started with the administration, right, pointing to economic data, for example. And now we've taken a turn and there's this highlight on the Fed's recent renovations.
Right. And Nancy Cook wrote this brilliant story about this. And it is one of Trump's absolute techniques that he uses for a lot of different things. We see it with him trying to distract people from the Jeffrey Epstein story. What he does is something called Steve Bannon coined flooding the zone. So Powell, isn't lowering interest rates. The Fed is renovating its building. This is wrong. He's a bad person. He just attacks from so many angles that it's impossible for the target to respond to one thing because another thing pops up over here and something else pops up over there. And that's what this renovation scandal, and I'm doing air quotes, was all about, because there was no scandal. It's a building built in the 1930s. It was filled with asbestos and lead. It hadn't been renovated since the 1930s. Yeah. And, it needed a little touch up. And I do think Trump sort of got that when he walked through yesterday.
He didn't find Versailles.
He didn't find Versailles.
I guess when he got there, as Russ Vought suggested. So again, is this simply about pressuring Powell to cut rates, or does Donald Trump want him to resign? He says it's not a fireable offense. But if you make life miserable enough for someone, and I know that Jay Powell has said he's going nowhere, is that the aim here?
Right. I think he really wants the interest rates down. I don't think he cares. Okay. I mean, he appointed Jay Powell in the first place. Yes, he did. And so at some point they saw eye to eye on things, enough for him to become the Fed chairman. And I think if Powell were to do that, then everything would be fine. If he doesn't, I also think Trump knows the blowback, not only politically but from the markets, of firing a Fed chair would be so severe that he's just going to keep needling Powell and needling him until his term is up in May 2026, because Powell is showing a great deal of confidence. Yeah. He doesn't need this job, right? And so he's showing a great deal of confidence and saying, this is what I think. Fire me if you will, but this is what I think is right for the economy, which the Fed chair gets to do in our country.
That's the way it works.
Yeah.
All right. Exactly. A lot to watch for here. Wendy Benjaminson, senior editor at Bloomberg, we thank you so much. And to continue this conversation, we want to bring in Lael Brainard, former director of the National Economic Council under the Biden administration, former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, now distinguished fellow at the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policies. Lael, thank you so much for joining Bloomberg. I just want to pick up on this conversation. President Trump says he's not going to fire Jerome Powell. So is this just all about trying to see lower rates next week when the FOMC meets?
There's probably a few things that are going on. One, I think it is an effort to pressure the Federal Reserve for lower rates. It's also a distraction. That was a picture for the ages yesterday. The president standing next to the chairman of the Federal Reserve wearing hard hats. Quite a story. And it also serves to find a place to have blame to the extent that the economy is not as strong as the president has said that it would be at this juncture. You heard him say that the Federal Reserve should be lowering rates, and that's the only thing standing in the way. So I think it does serve multiple purposes in terms of the storyline. But we also know that Federal Reserve chairs go down in history for actually following their mandate and not caving to political pressure. And those that do cave to political pressures tend not to be viewed very favorably in the history books.
Lael, it's great to have you with us. I want to ask you about the op-ed that you wrote recently in the Washington Post, an opinion piece with the headline, "The Real Reason Trump Wants to Fire the Fed Chair." You say it has everything to do with debt management. The president, you write, wants to reduce the debt service on the trillions his mega bill will add to the national debt. So now we're connecting the dots to the president's big, beautiful bill. The fact is, and you say this in your piece, they are saying it out loud. Lael Peter Navarro sat right at this desk a couple of days ago and talked about the need to lower interest rates in an effort to save $1 trillion when it comes to our debt. Is this the new mission creep? We hear a lot about mission creep in the central bank. Is this a version of that in your eyes?
Well, certainly this is the kind of diversion of the Federal Reserve from its core inflation fighting mission to supporting the administration's desire to finance this big new increase in the national debt cheaply. That is traditionally the way that central banks in other countries like Brazil or Turkey, Argentina, go awry and lose that credibility on inflation fighting. So I have to say that I was surprised to hear the president say it out loud when he says every percentage point reduction in interest rates translates into $300 billion. What he's talking about is interest payments on the national debt. And when he says, you know, if the Fed will cut by 3 percentage points down to 1 percentage point, that'll save us $1 trillion in debt service. That's what he's really referring to. And he said it quite explicitly. And economists have a term for it because it has happened so many times in history. It's called fiscal dominance, when debt management becomes more important for the central bank than fighting inflation. And what happens is you lose control of inflation, and ultimately long-term interest rates actually go up.
Well, we did actually get a different sort of answer when we posed this question to Joe Livornia, senior counselor to the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, about concerns when it comes to the long end of the yield curve. He joined us on Balance of Power last week. I want to play you some of his reaction and then get your reaction on the other side.
I don't see how markets are going to be worried about that. In fact, if you look at where yields are, they're lower than where they started the year. And when a lot of the people who are worried about the market selling off because of credibility and things of that sort, these are many of the same folks who back in April said the U.S. was uninvestable. And yet we had Treasury data that came out today that showed essentially record inflow into the market with Treasury demand virtually at an all-time high. So these arguments I don't think hold up to really scrutiny into the facts.
We should say that response was last week on July 17th. But Lael, I'm wondering what you make of that defense when it comes to this issue.
Well, what we did see when the markets were really reacting to news that this administration would really pressure the Federal Reserve and might fire the chair of the Federal Reserve back in April. That was the first time I think market participants really were digesting that news. And there was a lot of repositioning, as you'll recall. And what we saw is that the long end of the curve did actually go up quite a bit and the dollar weakened. That is the kind of response that you tend to see in circumstances where central banks lose credibility on the fight against inflation because investors demand more compensation to hold longer-term securities, sovereign securities, treasury securities, if they think that the currency is going to be weaker and inflation is going to go up. So that is just the traditional kind of market reaction. We have seen it. We certainly saw it back in April. Now, I believe markets have seen the president back down, say that he's not going to fire the Federal Reserve chair. Yesterday, he was even somewhat complimentary. And I think that's why you're not seeing those kinds of reactions right now in markets. But I do think the reaction we saw in April was a cautionary tale.
It did seem the president came fixing for a bit of a fight yesterday. Lael, I'm sure you were watching as the two wore hard hats. The president pulled a piece of paper out of his suit jacket to prove to the Fed chair that not only was the renovation at the Eccles building running over in terms of money, but more than he thought, and he added a whole new building to the list. Let's bring everybody back to the construction site. Watch and listen.
It looks like it's about $3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed. You're including the Martin renovation. You just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building.
Well, no, but it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago.
Well, I'd love him to lower interest rates, but other than that, what can I tell you?
Complete with a knock on the back there. Lael, I'm wondering, as you watched this and had a chance to digest everything that happened yesterday, does this go down as a good day for Fed independence?
Look, I think what was interesting is that the Federal Reserve had a chance to explain what was going on with their renovations. These are very old buildings. They have two buildings that really haven't been renovated, I think, since the 1930s, and one that just was renovated for the first time since the 1970s. And I thought what was interesting is that the president really came out of those discussions, really showing his long experience as a real estate developer. He talked about how hard it is to build on a former swamp and the kind of very expensive renovations that are necessary to really be secure in pushing down when there are concerns about the water table. So in a way, it was interesting to see the president getting into the complexities of the renovation. In that sense, yes, I think it was a good day just for transparency around the Federal Reserve, which is so important because the Federal Reserve has to be accountable to the public.
Well, I do want to go back to this idea of so-called mission creep that Joe had mentioned earlier. We've heard this critique from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, from Kevin Warsh, who we know is potentially in the running to be the next Fed chair. Do you think that it would be healthy for the Fed to conduct a review of its non-monetary policy activities? Is that something that you think would actually be a good thing for the Fed to look into, whether or not that's an external review, for example?
So I always think that the Federal Reserve benefits from being accountable and transparent to the public and particularly to Congress. I mean, it's really Congress who has oversight of the Federal Reserve, who wrote the Federal Reserve Act that governs the monetary policy and the Dodd-Frank Act that governs their responsibilities in financial stability policy. So I do think those kinds of reviews are very beneficial. And there are many mechanisms that the Federal Reserve could use to undertake such a review. The thing that would concern me, I have heard the Secretary of the Treasury saying that the administration would undertake a review, and that does raise some concerns.
Lael, I'm sorry we're out of time.
Sorry.
We'd love to have you come back to finish this conversation. It's wonderful to have you back on Balance of Power. Former Director, National Economic Council, former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, Lael Brainard, with us live from Washington, only here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Right now, we're waiting for President Trump to touch down in Scotland. He's heading overseas, and lawmakers in Washington are actually heading home for their August recess, where, Joe, they're going to have to answer to their constituents when it comes to perhaps the big achievement from the last few weeks, the big, beautiful bill, and a lot of other things that have happened recently in Congress. And one of the things we're watching for, though, new polling out, showing that despite perhaps unpopularity with that bill, President Trump's popularity has actually maintained course.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just the bill. It's the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. It's the stuff we've been talking about regarding trade, the uncertainty over tariffs. And look at this, unchanged really since April. Slightly underwater when you consider 46%, but not bad with all of the headlines that we've been looking at. Disapprove at 52%, Tyler, and you could potentially have a much different situation for Republican lawmakers, to your point, when they get home for August recess and getting an earful at town hall meetings that are about to begin.
And it was such a good point about the tariffs, too, because we have to keep in mind that President Trump really ran on his handling of the economy. Poll after poll leading up to the election kept telling us that that was really where he was significantly ahead, and that ultimately helped him clinch it. So amid so much uncertainty, as we're still waiting ahead of that August 1st deadline for some more tariff deals, these numbers are pretty remarkable.
Well, true. There is actually something really interesting that pops out of this poll. It's really important to go beyond the headline numbers sometimes. The fact of the matter is 47% in the survey rate the economy as excellent or good. That is a significant increase, an 11-point jump from April, and by far the highlight in this poll for Donald Trump. We're going to talk about this and what lawmakers are going to experience in the weeks ahead here now that recess has begun with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick is, of course, our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne is senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, what's your thought here on how you rationalize these approval ratings? We talked about some different numbers from Ipsos yesterday against some of the vitriol that lawmakers are expecting to hear when they get home.
Yeah, obviously, Joe, the point you make about the big jump in the approval of the economy is the standout number here, right? That's what's driving the sustainability of the Donald Trump approval rating. And it's different than any other poll I've seen, including the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index for the month, which I, of course, have to bring up, which actually is noticeably more depressing in the consumer attitudes than this poll would indicate. That being said, what's also really interesting is it's not arguable that the reconciliation bill is wildly unpopular. Most polls, including this one, give it approval at negative 60%. Immigration, even in this poll, has gone down in popularity for Donald Trump, and tariffs are wildly unpopular. So even though the three signature issues that have defined his presidency in the first 6 months are underwater with the electorate, he has sustained relative stability in his job approval rating.
Well, to that point, let's talk about the power of the base, Jeanne. This poll finds that 88% of GOP voters approve of President Trump's performance, with 66% strongly approving. With numbers like these, what kind of signal does that give to Republicans ahead of the midterms? Do they have to expand the base here when you have such a high number, 88% overall approving of his performance?
They do. It's a very strong number, and I've seen it in other polls on the base as high as 90+%. So he is doing very well in his base, despite their frustration with or concerns about the Epstein issue and some of the issues that Rick just talked about, including his signature issue of immigration, where his poll numbers with his base have gone down. I do think what this means is that they're going to have to focus on the midterm and shore up that base and make sure they can get them out to vote. And one thing we know is it's a lot easier to get people out to vote when they're angry rather than when they're satisfied. I will give Donald Trump credit for this. He has done already 6 months in a lot more work towards the midterm than I think most presidents do, and much more than he focused on it in the first term. I mean, he is really focused like a laser beam on this midterm election. So Democrats who think they can sort of run on a history where the other party will do worse, they have their work cut out for them, but they have some things going for them, including this dislike of everything he's done on the big, beautiful bill, the tariffs and immigration, 3 signature issues.
I suspect we'll hear the name Jeffrey Epstein at most all of these town hall meetings. 76% of voters in this new poll in the Wall Street Journal. By the way, that includes 64% of Republicans say they believe the Justice Department is hiding important information when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. Rick, they're going to be Democratic trackers at all of these town halls, right? If you're a Republican lawmaker, how do you manage this?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a slew of viral videos coming out of town halls over the course of the next couple of weeks for these House members doing so. indicating a lot of anger and frustration over their inability to make public the documents they promised they would do related to the Jeffrey Epstein case. And everyone already is on defense in Washington, right? This thing has turned into a mess. But Democrats are taking advantage of it, as well they should. And there's trackers are going to be in all these swing districts. And there's, as Ricky Ricardo used to say, there's lots of splaining to do, to these constituents who are wondering, hey, you promised to get this done and you haven't done it yet. So Republicans are going to have to be pretty agile on how they manage this situation at home.
Oh. Well, is that the strategy then for Democrats on the other side, Jeanne? Because, yes, we have some of these pretty good talking points when it comes to Epstein and how unpopular we know the big, beautiful bill is. But we already are hearing from Republicans starting to message around the idea of a government shutdown in the fall when they get back in. Talk about the potency here of all these different threads that Democrats have the ability to pull on. But they're also up against that pretty hard messaging from the GOP.
They absolutely are, Tyler. I mean, the issue of the shutdown, we're going to really see how agile the Democrats can be. I think there is a message there for them to say that the administration, Republicans, are not willing to cross the aisle and deal with them in a fair, bipartisan manner. But it's not an easy message to make. They are starting to get out there more on the Epstein issue. I saw recently, when I was venturing through TikTok, some video of Ron DeSantis fending off some of the people talking about the Epstein case. We're going to see a lot more of that, to Rick's point. Also, we are seeing billboards around the country already talking about the big, beautiful bill and labeling the shutdown, particularly in rural communities of these hospitals and medical centers, as Trump's doing, the Republicans doing. So Democrats will try to run against the big, beautiful bill on repeal, on holding Republicans to the fire on Epstein, and they're going to have to watch their back on this shutdown message. So it's going to be a fun midterm, to say the least, Tyler. We're going to have a lot of fun.
And it starts now, Jeanne. And, when you talk about Jeffrey Epstein, you have to mention a half dozen other stories that the White House has thrown up in the air to get us talking about other stuff. Look no further than this headline, with the Senate Judiciary Republicans John Cornyn and Lindsey Graham now calling on the Attorney General to appoint a special counsel to investigate President Barack Obama, his staff, members of his administration. The president saying in the driveway today that the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity probably means that Obama's going to be fine. Everybody else, not so much. Is this the kind of overreach Democrats are hoping for?
It absolutely. This puts the Republicans in a difficult situation. They don't much like special counsels, as we can remember. And when Laura Loomer was calling for one in the Epstein case, they shied away from that. So, yeah, they're going to have a difficult time then calling for just certain special counsels and not others, and getting over their dislike of special counsels to begin with. So, and by the way, Donald Trump is right. He is protected as well as Barack Obama when it comes to immunity.
Well, Rick, just in our final couple minutes here, I'd love your perspective on this, too. Is this going to be too far of a push when it comes for Republicans? Could this backfire?
Yeah, I really don't get it. We're kind of all falling into this, sort of conspiracy theory trap. And that stuff's great, sitting around the fire in the winter when you got nothing else to do but drink whiskey and talk about, conspiracy theories. But arguably the polling we were just talking about indicates that Donald Trump's got a little bit of wind at his back. Assuming he can get these tariffs done, immigration is now down to 0 on the border, and the economy seems to be starting to percolate along. I mean, certainly a record day on the markets today. Why in the world would you distract anybody from that message set? I mean, it's like the administration is going out of their way to distract people from what's really important to them. These conspiracy theories are only important to the core base of the MAGA movement that are going to do nothing but vote for Donald Trump, no matter how many times he runs for president. And so, there is indications that independents are starting to get a little fed up with this stuff, and they've got to focus on those guys if they want to have a Republican Congress in 2027. Wow.
We've just got a minute left here, Jeanne, as you consider the options ahead here for President Trump. He's going to be meeting with the Europeans on Sunday. To Rick's point, if he can land a deal with the EU, does that approval rating get back above water, over 50, in his first year in office?
I don't know if the EU will be enough, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. I think China is going to be critically important. And Joe, I can't get over Rick talking about winter fires and whiskey. So I'm having a hard time answering your question as I think about these days and Rick around the fire. But yeah, it would help, but I don't think it'll change it completely.
All right, our political panel today, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. We thank you both, and stick with us. We're going to talk more about the future of the Israel-Hamas conflict next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As we turn to an important story that has been underreported this week with the storm of news coming out of Washington. Everything from Jeffrey Epstein to pressure on Jay Powell, uncertainty over tariffs. Tyler, it's kind of hard to get noticed sometimes in a 24-hour news cycle like this, but we want to turn to what's happening abroad with some pretty important stuff happening in the Middle East.
Right. A big development that the Gaza ceasefire talks were essentially dealt a new blow yesterday. We saw the U.S. and Israel pull out their negotiating teams, and we had heard from President Trump that a deal was going to be imminent. So this did come as a surprise.
They've pulled off the table in Qatar. The president was asked about it this morning as he left the White House on his way to Scotland for why and what comes next.
I speak to him, but I can't tell you what I spoke to him about. But it was sort of disappointing, although I told you. I told you, when you get down to those last 20 hostages, you get down to that last 10 or 20, it's going to be very hard for Hamas to make a deal because they lose their shield, they lose their cover. We got a lot of them out, a lot of them. We took a lot of bodies out, too.
He went on to say that Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. I think they want to die. That's a direct quote as we bring in Hagar Chemali, the former director for Syria and Lebanon on the National Security Council in the Obama administration. She's CEO and founder of Greenwich Media Strategies. Hagar, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Some pretty stark comments coming from the president earlier today. He says, as you just heard, we're down to the final hostages. And they know, referring to Hamas, what happens after you get the final hostages, suggesting, of course, that they lose leverage here. Hagar, how significant is this latest development?
That's right. That's President Trump really telling it like it is. You know, he's not sugarcoating it at all. It is a significant development because there was real hope that this round of ceasefire talks would work. That's why Steve Witkoff went to Rome and then Doha. That's why Ron Dermer was involved. And Steve Witkoff himself said he wasn't even going to participate or travel if they weren't actually going to be serious. But things started to look a little bit hairy earlier this week when Hamas responded initially to this latest ceasefire proposal with demands apparently that were so absurd that the Egyptians and Qataris told Hamas to go back and come back with new demands because they weren't even going to present them to the Israelis. And so from the beginning, we see that. But it's, Trump put it very succinctly. And the fact is that Hamas is standing on its last leg. And there's a pro and a con with that when you're talking about negotiations, because on one hand, they want to survive. And the only bargaining chip they have left are the remaining hostages. So on one hand, you kind of have them by the neck against the wall. But on the other hand, that's why they want the ceasefire talks to include a permanent end to the war, because that's the only thing that's going to assure their survival. And if they give up hostages, they know that 60-day window that this ceasefire would have given likely wouldn't have reached an end to the war, because Israel and Ron Dermer himself has said this publicly numerous times, that the goal ultimately is to obliterate Hamas completely. Its military capabilities, its ability to govern Gaza, and Hamas knows that. And that's why ultimately, no matter what you do, Hamas is not going to want to make a deal that doesn't include a permanent end to the war.
So, Hagar, if that's the backdrop here and what ultimately perhaps led to this blow to the negotiations, how do the parties regroup from here? Is this the end of diplomatic talks? How do they get this back on track?
Well, so I've heard some people call it an earthquake when the U.S. in particular walked out. And I would agree that that's a big earthquake because they've been negotiating for months. And Trump, in his statement today, he said also, he said, this is just Hamas wants to die. They're asking to die. And for the Israeli government, by the way, where you have a set policy and strategy set out by Netanyahu and the cabinet to completely obliterate Hamas, this is basically the go-ahead as well, right? To finish off the job in Gaza, which is what Trump said. And so it's not impossible for talks to start up again. The Israelis have said that if Hamas comes back to the table with demands that are negotiable, they said, by the way, that those demands were related to the number of Palestinian prisoners that Hamas wanted released. I also know separately that a lot of the sticking points had to do with the extent to which the Israeli army withdrew from certain areas, that Hamas wanted them to withdraw even further. And so, you have, like, as with any negotiation, those final sticking points. It's not impossible, but it's certainly a blow, and I would expect the Israeli government to amp up its efforts again in Gaza at this point.
Enter Emmanuel Macron. I want to ask you what the French are doing here. Hagar, and if it matters, as we reported yesterday, the French say they will recognize a Palestinian state, the first Western nation, the first of the G7 to do so, and will do that before the UN Security Council. President Trump, Hagar, was asked about that in the same romp with reporters this morning, referring to Macron. He said, quote, "Here's the good news. What he says doesn't matter," unquote. Is Donald Trump right?
Yes, I mean, to put it very bluntly, and as you know, I tell it like it is, the French are making dumb moves. And it's true, in the world of geopolitical power, if we are very honest with ourselves, the entire world could recognize a Palestinian state. And if the U.S. doesn't, and if Israel doesn't, then it doesn't really mean much at the end of the day, because you need those two to recognize a Palestinian state for that state to actually exist the way it needs to. Now, again, I am not a proponent, by the way, of the status quo. I think the status quo is awful. I am myself a two-stater. I always have been. And I actually would even go, by the way, on this point, and as you know, I tend to be quite hawkish when it comes to my foreign policies. But when on this point, I tend to lean quite liberal, and I believe that you could recognize a Palestinian state at the outset, even of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, meaning talks between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. But doing it at this time only sends one message, and that message is that violent resistance can be rewarded. That after a while, and after pressure, and after screaming, and after pursuing October 7th, and after having movements around the world where they're calling to globalize the Intifada, that yes, you can win and have a Palestinian state. But at the end of the day, what does it mean? We don't know the borders. We don't know what it would look like. No one else is going to recognize it the way a state should be recognized. And on top of it, for the French to do it simultaneously while releasing a convicted murderer, he was a Lebanese individual. His name is George Abdallah, who was convicted for murdering an Israeli diplomat and U.S. military official 40 years ago in France on the supposed pro-resistance, pro-Palestinian movement. They released him today. He went back to Lebanon. He received an embarrassing welcome parade. And to do that on the same day only reinforces that message. So if the French goal was to say, hey, we want to move forward and we want a Palestinian state, I'm not against that goal. But to do it at this time in the middle of a war with no strategy attached just comes off like all talk without any goal actually achieved.
Well, I want to actually build on this, too, and this broader idea about allies when they do put pressure, perhaps, on the U.S. What does that do to the U.S.-Israel relationship when you see France come out with a decision like this? When we're talking about the broader policy here, does that perhaps actually bolster the U.S. in the other way? I'd love your perspective on sort of the dynamic that we see emerge.
Yes, I would argue that it would bolster it the other way. In fact, you've seen, right, throughout these several months, or even if you look back to October 7th, too, the U.S.-Israeli relationship has only become stronger. But if you look at just the last few months where there have been these suspicions that, the U.S.-Israel relationship is strained, things between Netanyahu and Trump have been strained, I think that really couldn't be farther from the truth. And we're seeing that play out over and over again. Where this could undermine alliances and relationships is actually among the UN Security Council membership, the G7, the U.S.-French relationship. I mean, Trump, he said it, again, he doesn't sugarcoat it, right? He says it like it is. And he said about Macron, he said, I like the guy, But what he said doesn't matter, and this isn't going to do anything. And I agree with that. So I don't think that this is going to undermine the U.S.-French relationship so much so that you see this big chasm. But I will tell you, for U.S. efforts to pursue peace in the region, with this kind of move, the French are not going to be involved. And that's something the French president has to think about, because he is trying to be relevant. He's trying to find a place for himself and for the French government in moving forward on the Middle East. And doing this kind of move just makes it look like they're not coordinated and that they're on the outs. And so the French really stand to lose a lot with this move, in my view. It might undermine things in particular with the U.S. and France, but I certainly don't think it'll undermine the U.S.-Israel relationship. As you said, on the contrary, it'll only bolster it.
Heard from Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy to the Middle East, of course, among other things. He says Hamas does not appear to be coordinated or acting in good faith. Is that actually true?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a terrorist organization, so of course they're not going to act in good faith. And that's always the case, right? They're always dragging their feet. And that's going to be the case whether you're negotiating, by the way, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with the Iranian regime. And fundamentally, that's because we have to understand their goals. Hamas, at the end of the day, and they state it over and over again, is to have an Islamist caliphate where you have the state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And their goal is to kill Jews and Americans. In fact, you have two militants just this week who went out to say that after they succeeded that the next thing would be that they're going to kill Christians and Americans next. This is what Hamas is. So how really can you negotiate in good faith? At the end of the day, when you have negotiations, every party is going to have their goals, and their goals are always going to be very different. In this case, they're completely contradictory, because Hamas just wants to survive, and the Israeli government has made it very clear that they cannot, following October 7. So you're going to have that. But the process with any negotiation is finding something that other side wants that you can give, so that you can try to get closer to your goal. And it's very hard to see how you're going to bridge that gap with this effort as you get closer and closer to a situation where Hamas loses all of the hostages, right? That's the only reason Hamas has any leg to stand on left. It's because of those hostages. But no, I absolutely agree. Of course, they haven't negotiated in good faith this entire time, and they never will, and they never did. But I really do think that they are writing their names in the tombstones. The problem is that Hamas, unlike any other fighting machine, is putting its civilians in front of them as their shield. And so, unfortunately, I think that I really do expect things to get worse over the next few months. Unfortunately, it's really unfortunate. Wow. I really wish that weren't the case. But I see that's the only way it's going to go.
Does sound like things are getting worse, not getting better. Hagar, it's great to have you back with us, as always. Hagar Chemali with us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Having spent time on the White House National Security Council with Syria and Lebanon, the Middle East in her portfolio, now at Greenwich Media Strategies, and a voice that we rely on here a lot on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Tyler Kendall. We appreciate you spending some time with us today on the fastest show in politics, and we'll meet you back here at 5 p.m. Eastern for the late edition of Balance of Power. We're going to have a lot to wrap up. The president will just be arriving in Scotland a bit later on today as well. We'll have much more next on Bloomberg.